You know, every once in a while, history hides a story so quiet, so ordinary looking, that you almost miss it. And yet, it changes everything. Picture this: a young man in his 20s, on the eve of one of the darkest chapters in human history, sitting at a small desk in Prague, surrounded by frightened parents, worn passports, and piles of handwritten lists. Outside, winter bites the city, and Nazi troops are closing in. Inside, he's scribbling names, stamping papers, and writing letters to British officials who don't even know who he is. He's not a soldier. He's not a politician. He's just a stockbroker with a stubborn sense of right and wrong. His name is Nicholas Winton. And before the war begins, before anyone knows the full horror that's coming, he's about to save 669 children from almost certain death. If you love stories that reveal the hidden heroes of history, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and share this video with a friend who loves true stories from the Second World War. It helps more than you think, and it keeps these forgotten voices alive. Now, let's go back to where it all began. England, 1938. Nicholas Winton wasn't what you'd expect from a war hero. He was born in Hampstead, London, in 1909 to a German Jewish family that had converted to Christianity and changed their surname from Wertheim to Winton. They wanted to blend in, to start fresh in Britain. Nicholas grew up speaking German and English, sharp as a whip, and deeply curious about the world. He had this quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't need to shout. People remembered him as calm, serious, with that spark of mischief that makes you trust a man's courage. By his late 20s, he was working as a stockbroker in London, a steady, respectable job. But he wasn't one to sit comfortably while others suffered. When he saw something wrong, he acted. And in December 1938, when most young men were thinking about Christmas parties and stock prices, a friend of his, Martin Blake, wrote from Prague and said, "You should come here. There's something happening." That simple letter changed his life. Winton could have ignored it. Of course, he had a good life, a warm home, a promising career, but curiosity and conscience pulled him. Within days, he'd taken time off work and hopped on a plane to Czechoslovakia, a country teetering on the edge of invasion. When he arrived in Prague, the city was a mess of fear and desperation. Refugee camps filled with Jews who had fled from Germany and Austria after Hitler's Anschluss. Families sleeping in cold gymnasiums, clutching their children, waiting for someone, anyone, to help. The world was watching, but doing very little. Britain and France had just signed the Munich Agreement, giving Hitler control of the Sudetenland in exchange for peace, a peace that wouldn't last. And Winton, standing in the middle of that chaos, realized something that most people didn't want to face. War was coming. Inside a small hotel room, volunteers from the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia were already trying to get people out. But the focus was on adults, politicians, intellectuals, those in immediate danger. Winton looked around and asked, "What about the children?" Nobody had an answer. That's when he decided to act. He took a small table in the lobby of the Prague Hotel and set up what became known as his office. He didn't have authority, money, or even an organization behind him. Just a notebook, a typewriter, and the will to do something. Parents began showing up by the dozens, desperate to get their children to safety. Imagine that scene: mothers clutching babies, fathers trembling as they filled out forms, hoping this Englishman they just met could save their child. Winton wrote down every name, every address. He took photographs, arranged for identity papers, and promised to do everything he could to get their children out of the country. Back in London, his parents were stunned when Nicholas returned home with a suitcase full of documents and said, "I need your help." He set up a rescue office at his dining room table in Hampstead. His mother, Barbara, became his assistant, typing letters and calling officials, while Nicholas went from embassy to embassy, pleading for visas. The British government wasn't exactly enthusiastic. They allowed child refugees only if a £50 guarantee was paid for each one, to ensure they wouldn't become a burden to the state. £50 was a fortune in those days. So Winton and his friends started fundraising, going door to door, asking churches and charities for help. He wrote to the Home Office, the Foreign Office, and every newspaper he could think of. Some bureaucrats told him to leave it alone, too complicated, too risky. But he didn't stop. He was 29 years old and working a full-time job at the stock exchange by day, organizing a child rescue operation by night. He'd type letters until his fingers hurt. The paperwork was maddening. Every child needed a visa, a medical record, a photo, a sponsor in Britain willing to take them in. The Nazis hadn't yet sealed the borders, but time was slipping away by March 1939. The first train was ready. Winton's team had found homes for the children in Britain, arranged transport, and got the necessary permits. On March 14th, the first group of 20 children boarded a train in Prague. The very next day, Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia. The clock was now ticking faster than ever. Winton kept going. He organized train after train, each carrying dozens of children. They traveled through Germany to the Netherlands, then by ferry to England, where new families waited at the stations with open arms. The children clutched small suitcases, some with a favorite toy or a photo of their parents, most of whom they would never see again. And yet, he never saw himself as a hero. In his own words, he said later, "I just saw something that needed to be done, and I did it." That humility, that simple clarity, was what made him remarkable. He managed to arrange 8 trains in total between March and August 1939. The last one, scheduled to leave on September 1st with 250 more children, never made it out. That morning, Germany invaded Poland, and all borders were closed. The war had begun. Those children were trapped. Most of them, as later records showed, perished in concentration camps. Winton carried that heartbreak all his life. What's incredible is how little he spoke of it afterward. He married, raised a family, returned to his quiet life. He never told anyone, not his colleagues, not even his wife, about what he'd done. Decades passed. Then, in 1988, something extraordinary happened. His wife, Greet, was cleaning their attic when she found an old leather briefcase filled with lists. letters, and photographs of the rescued children. She asked him about it, and in his typical understated way, he said, "Oh, yes, that's something I did before the war." She was stunned. She gave the documents to a historian, and soon the story reached a television program called That's Life. In 1988, Nicholas Winton, now an elderly man with gentle eyes and thinning hair, was invited to the show, completely unaware of what was about to happen. The host began reading from one of his old lists and said, "Is there anyone in the audience who owes their life to Nicholas Winton?" One by one, people stood up, then dozens more. These were the children he'd saved, now adults, parents, grandparents themselves. The look on Winton's face as he turned, realizing he was surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives existed because of him. It's one of the most moving moments ever broadcast on television. That single moment turned him from an unknown pensioner into a global symbol of compassion and courage. Reporters flooded his home. Honors followed: the British knighthood, recognition from the Czech Republic, and countless awards. Yet he always seemed slightly embarrassed by the attention. He'd say, "Why me? Others did much more." But those 669 lives, each one a universe of possibilities, were saved because a single man refused to look away. He didn't have power or wealth, but he had heart. And that proved enough. Before we continue into how his operation actually worked, the logistics, the letters, the constant danger of discovery, and the aftermath for those children, take a second, if you haven't already, to hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what you think drives a person like Winton to act when others freeze. I'd love to hear your thoughts. When you look closer at how Winton actually pulled off his rescue, it becomes even more astonishing. He didn't have a large staff or government support. He had a few volunteers, mostly young British and Czech helpers, working out of cramped spaces filled with typewriters, coffee cups, and stacks of paper that seemed to multiply every hour. They called it the children's section of the refugee committee, but in reality, it was Winton's operation in name only. His desk was chaos: maps of train routes, letters from parents, telegrams from British foster families, and endless lists. Every name was a child, every name a life hanging by a thread. He divided the tasks. In Prague, a small team led by Trevor Chadwick and Darine Warner helped gather the children, collect photographs, and handle the Czech side of things. They were fearless. They met secretly with Jewish community leaders, priests, even trained officials who could be bribed or persuaded to look the other way. Chadwick, a school teacher from Dorset, was especially brave. He stayed in Prague long after Winton had returned to London, personally escorting children to the trains under increasing Nazi surveillance. Without Chadwick, many of those children would never have made it out. Meanwhile, back in London, Winton was waging a different kind of battle against British bureaucracy. Imagine the frustration, trying to convince the government to let hundreds of foreign children into the country at a time when xenophobia was quietly spreading and officials were terrified of Nazi spies slipping through the cracks. Every form had to be perfect. Every signature had to match. Every child needed a host family, a medical certificate, and a sponsor who could pay the £50 guarantee. Winton turned persuasion into an art form. He wrote thousands of letters to churches, community groups, newspapers, even private citizens. One of his letters to the Times pleaded for more foster homes, describing innocent children facing persecution and death if help didn't come soon. The British public responded. Families from all over the country began writing back, offering to take in children they'd never met, from a country they'd never visited. It was the quiet kindness of ordinary people that made his plan work. He was meticulous. Each child's photo and details were carefully recorded on index cards, with notes about their age, religion, health, and the names of their parents. He insisted on matching them with the right family, not just anyone who volunteered. Sometimes he'd stay up half the night writing thank you notes to donors and sponsors. Other times, he'd be in tears reading letters from Czech parents who could barely bring themselves to say goodbye. Some enclosed locks of hair, or photos, or tiny trinkets for their children to remember them by. The train departures were heartbreaking scenes. At Prague's Wilson station, families stood behind barriers, waving as their children leaned out of windows. There was always a sense of dread, the fear that they might never meet again. Guards with swastikas patrolled the platforms, shouting orders. The parents tried to stay brave, but many broke down as the train pulled away. Survivors would later recall the sound, that low, haunting whistle that signaled both rescue and separation. Winton knew the risks. The Gestapo could have stopped those trains at any time. Sometimes he'd receive telegrams saying a transport had been delayed or questioned. Those were long nights. He would wait by the phone, pacing, smoking, hoping for news that they'd made it across the German border safely. When confirmation came, he'd breathe again. For a while. By August 1939, he'd arranged for nearly 700 children to reach Britain. He was still trying to organize more right up until war broke out. That final train, the one with 250 children who never left, haunted him for the rest of his life. He once said that not saving those last ones felt like failure. But the truth is, he'd already done something no one else had managed. The scale of what he achieved becomes clear when you compare it to other operations at the time. Across Europe, similar child rescues were attempted, like the Kindertransport that brought around 10,000 Jewish children to Britain from Germany and Austria. But Winton's operation was unique because it was entirely his own initiative, privately run, almost underground, and accomplished in just 9 months. When war began, he didn't stop helping people. He volunteered for the Red Cross, then joined the Royal Air Force, serving as an officer responsible for training airmen. Even in uniform, he remained modest, never mentioning what he'd done in Prague. After the war, he worked for international refugee organizations and later devoted himself to humanitarian causes, especially those supporting disabled children. But what's striking is how quietly he carried the weight of his secret. For nearly 50 years, he never spoke of it publicly. Not once. His children grew up unaware. His colleagues at the stock exchange knew him as a polite, hard-working man who played bridge and loved gardening. It was only when his wife stumbled upon that briefcase in 1988 that the world found out. Inside that case were meticulously kept documents, lists of the rescued children, letters from parents, visa requests, and photos showing groups of boys and girls in coats and hats, smiling bravely before their journey. Greed knew instantly that this was something extraordinary. She handed it over to a historian, who traced many of the names and discovered that most of them were still alive, living in Britain, Israel, America, Canada. They had become teachers, doctors, artists, engineers, parents, and grandparents. A whole new generation existed because of what one man had done in his 20s, and then quietly forgotten. When the television producers contacted him, Winton was hesitant. He didn't understand why his story mattered. But when That's Life aired that legendary episode, and the host asked, "Is there anyone here who owes their life to Nicholas Winton?" And the audience stood, one by one. You could see the realization wash over him, that his small act of conscience had rippled through decades, creating an entire living legacy. Some of those survivors later called themselves Winton's children. Among them were people like Vera Gissing, who went on to write about her rescue, describing how she remembered his kindness and the way he knelt to speak to her eye to eye. When she boarded the train, she said he wasn't dramatic or loud, just kind and determined. That's what stuck with her. Another survivor, Joe Schlesinger, became a renowned journalist in Canada and often said that Winton's quiet courage was the reason he ever had a life at all. You have to remember that these weren't numbers. They were lives, filled with laughter, love, careers, families, grief, and everything in between. And all of it traced back to a young man in a small Prague hotel lobby, making lists by hand while the world turned away. It's hard not to wonder what was going through his mind back then. He once said he couldn't stand seeing injustice and doing nothing. Maybe that was it. Maybe that's all heroism really is. Seeing the wrong and deciding it's your job to make it right. After the rediscovery of his story, the world tried to give him the recognition he'd never sought. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II in 2003, becoming Sir Nicholas Winton. The Czech Republic honored him with the Order of the White Lion, their highest award. In Prague, a statue now stands on the platform of the station where those children once departed. A bronze figure of him holding a young boy's hand, a suitcase at his feet. Looking toward the horizon, travelers pass by every day, often stopping to touch this sculpture or leave flowers. What I find most moving is that he continued corresponding with many of the people he saved. Even in his old age, he'd receive letters on birthdays, invitations to weddings, photos of grandchildren. They never forgot. How could they? Every life milestone they had was a quiet echo of his choice in 1939. He died in 2015, at the age of 106, in his sleep. At his funeral, there were children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of the people he rescued. Hundreds of lives filling the pews, all connected to one man's decision to act. But before we move to the last stretch of his story, how his actions reshaped how we think about moral courage, and how those rescued children carried his legacy forward into the modern world, take a moment. If you haven't yet, to subscribe, like, and share this story. Leave a comment telling me if you think you'd have had the same courage in his place. It's a hard question, but an honest one. After his death in 2015, the world paused. Newspapers called him Britain's Schindler, though Winton never liked that comparison. He said what he did was nothing compared to the scale and danger faced by Oskar Schindler in Nazi-occupied Poland. But that humility is precisely what made him extraordinary. In every interview, he brushed away praise like dust on a jacket. It wasn't a big deal. He'd say, "I just saw people in trouble and did what I could." You could hear the quiet defiance in his voice. Not arrogance, but a gentle insistence that goodness doesn't need medals to matter. The people he saved disagreed. Of course, for them, he wasn't just a rescuer. He was the invisible thread that stitched their lives to the future. Take Lord Alf Dubs, for example, one of the rescued children who later became a member of the British Parliament. He devoted much of his career to advocating for refugees, especially unaccompanied minors fleeing war. Dubs said he owed his entire life to Winton and tried to carry that same spirit into his political work. It's powerful when you think about it. The way compassion multiplies across generations, like a flame passed quietly from one hand to another. And that's really what Nicholas Winton's story is about. Not glory, not heroism in the cinematic sense, but moral clarity, the kind that doesn't depend on orders or applause. He didn't wait for permission to do what was right. He didn't ask whether it would be successful or even safe. He just started. That's the rarest quality of all. In times of fear, most people freeze or turn inward. Winton turned outward. In later interviews, when journalists asked why he kept silent about it for 50 years, he shrugged. "Because nobody asked me," he said. But there's another layer to that, I think. People who act from conscience rarely feel the need to broadcast it. They don't see it as a story worth telling, just something that needed to be done. And maybe he also knew that history often forgets the quiet ones, those who move mountains without raising their voice. What's remarkable is how close his story came to being lost entirely. If that briefcase hadn't been found, if his wife hadn't opened it and insisted it mattered, we might never have known. That thought alone gives me chills. How fragile memory is. How easily the greatest acts of goodness can vanish into dust. But perhaps it also shows that truth has a strange way of resurfacing. When the world is ready to listen, over the years, documentaries, books, and films were made about him. There was Nicholas Winton, The Power of Good in 2002, which won an international Emmy, and more recently won Life, starring Anthony Hopkins as the older Winton. Hopkins captured him perfectly, the calm precision, the soft humor, and the weight of quiet sorrow behind his eyes. Watching that film, you can almost feel what it must have been like for him to sit decades later, remembering those children, wondering what became of them. But there's something else about Winton's story that's easy to overlook. The danger he faced at the time. People often imagine that pre-war Prague in 1938 was still relatively safe, but it wasn't. The Gestapo was already watching refugee networks. The trains had to pass through German territory, and at any moment, an official could have stopped them. One wrong document, one rumor, and the operation could have been exposed. If it had been, he could have been charged with aiding Jews, a crime that carried severe penalties. Yet he kept going. He didn't even have diplomatic immunity or any formal protection. He was just an ordinary man taking extraordinary risks. And he wasn't doing it alone. That's important to remember. The world likes to turn such stories into tales of lone heroes. But Winton himself always credited his collaborators, Doreen Warner, Trevor Chadwick, Beatrice Wellington, and others. Without them, his lists would have been useless. It took a network of ordinary people, train conductors, embassy clerks, foster parents, donors, all quietly defying indifference. Heroism in this story isn't a single man standing tall. It's a web of kindness, a chorus of small acts harmonizing into something larger. One of the most poignant details came from a child's diary recovered years later. A little girl named Hannah wrote on the day she left Prague. "The man said we will go to England. Mama said be brave. I am trying to be brave." She survived. Her parents did not. Her entry ends there, but her children and grandchildren are alive today because of that promise. When you think of that, the numbers -669 stop being statistics. They become a forest of stories, each one rooted in courage and watered by tears. There's a photograph taken in 1939 of one of those train departures. The platform is crowded with children clutching little suitcases, tags tied around their necks. Some are crying, others look dazed, and in the corner, if you look closely, there's a man in a dark coat, not posing, not looking at the camera, just watching, making sure everything runs smoothly. That's Nicholas Winton. No drama, no fanfare, just a quiet guardian in the chaos. When survivors were interviewed decades later, many said they remembered his calmness. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they trusted him. One woman said, "He looked at us as if we mattered." That might be the purest form of goodness. Seeing someone's worth even when the world tells you they're disposable. The older Winton often said he wasn't sure he'd done enough. That's the irony of people like him. Those who do the most good often doubt themselves the most. He carried guilt about the final train that never left, about the children who didn't make it. But guilt, in a strange way, is part of compassion. It's what separates those who care from those who only watch. His daughter, Barbara, once said that her father's greatest lesson wasn't just to act, but to believe that one person can make a difference. She wrote a biography of him titled "If It's Not Impossible: The Life of Sir Nicholas Winton." That title came from one of his sayings: if it's not impossible, then it can be done. It's simple, almost casual, but it carried the stubborn optimism that defined him. That philosophy wasn't just words. Even in his later years, he continued to support charities for disadvantaged children, visiting schools, encouraging young people to volunteer. When asked what advice he'd give the next generation, he said, "Don't be content when you see something wrong. Don't wait for others to fix it." There's a deep practicality to that, not idealism, but moral realism. He knew the world was broken, but he also knew that excuses never saved anyone. And maybe that's why his story resonates so powerfully today. We live in an age where the world's problems feel enormous and far away. refugee crises, wars, political chaos, and it's easy to feel helpless. But Winton's life reminds us that moral courage starts in small rooms, at kitchen tables, with people who refuse to look away. You don't need a government post or a badge. Sometimes all it takes is a list, a phone, and a heart that can't stand injustice. I sometimes imagine him in that cramped hotel lobby in Prague, pencil in hand, children's voices echoing down the hall, the snow falling outside, and think, history isn't made by speeches or battles. It's made by moments like that, one man choosing to care when it would have been easier not to dot as we move toward the final chapter of his legacy. How those rescued children built their lives, and how the world finally learned his name. Make sure you're subscribed if you haven't yet. Tap the bell icon, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what this story makes you feel. Because this isn't just history. It's a mirror, and somewhere in that reflection, we all have to ask ourselves what kind of person we'd be if faced with the same choice. After the television broadcast, life for Nicholas Winton changed in ways he never expected. For half a century, he had been a quiet man living in the shadows of his own humility, and suddenly the world knew his name. Letters poured in from every corner of the globe, from people he'd saved, from their children, from complete strangers who just wanted to say thank you. He answered as many as he could, in neat handwriting, always polite, always slightly puzzled by the attention. He told one interviewer, "It's embarrassing, really. I just did what anyone else should have done." But, of course, not everyone would have. That's what made him special. He was invited to schools, universities, parliaments, even the United Nations, to speak about what he'd done. He wasn't a natural performer, and he didn't like the spotlight. But when he spoke, there was a quiet authority in his words. He didn't lecture or boast. He told stories. He described how the parents looked when they handed over their children, the smell of the train platforms, the paperwork that nearly defeated him, and the hope that never quite went out. He said he never thought of himself as brave. "I just didn't see any point in sitting around doing nothing." In those later years, he became almost a moral compass for people trying to understand the weight of individual action. Politicians quoted him. Activists invoked his name. Documentaries explored his methods. And all the while, he remained grounded. He still wore the same watch, still tended his garden, still made tea for visitors himself. Fame hadn't touched him. It couldn't. His sense of purpose was too simple to be shaken by medals or microphones. One of the most emotional moments of his later life came in 2014 when he returned to Prague at the age of 105. The Czech president awarded him the Order of the White Lion, the nation's highest honor. As he sat in his wheelchair, frail but alert, a choir of children sang for him. Some of them were descendants of those he had rescued. His eyes filled with tears. He whispered, "I never expected any of this." You could see it in his face. That strange blend of pride and sorrow that comes from seeing both the best and worst of humanity in one lifetime. And then, less than a year later, he passed away, July 1st, 2015, peacefully in his sleep. There was something fitting about that. The man who had given peace to so many children left the world in peace himself. The news spread quickly. Candlelight vigils appeared in London, Prague, Jerusalem. World leaders paid tribute. But perhaps the most touching memorial came from the Winton children. They gathered together, old now, some with grandchildren in tow, and spoke not of tragedy, but of gratitude. One said, "He didn't just save our lives, he saved our faith in goodness." His story has a strange way of sneaking up on you. You don't feel the weight of it all at once. It grows in you slowly, like the realization that greatness doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, "There's no time to waste," and picks up a pen. When you think about how close those children came to being swallowed by the Holocaust, and then imagine the lives they built, the families, the laughter, the contributions to science, art, and politics, it's overwhelming. The ripple effect of one man's choice stretches into eternity. And it wasn't luck or privilege that made him act. It was empathy. Winton understood, even as a young man, that humanity's real strength lies not in armies or governments, but in compassion. It's what he tried to teach until his very last days. He once said, "The world will not be destroyed by evil people, but by those who sit and let it happen." That sentence, simple as it sounds, holds the entire weight of his philosophy. The rescued children carried his spirit with them. Many became advocates for justice, human rights, and refugee protection. They knew, better than anyone, what happens when people look away. One of them, a woman named Renata, said in an interview, "When I feel tired or discouraged, I think of Mr. Winton sitting at that table, filling out those forms, and I realize I have no right to give up." That's legacy, not statues, not awards, but the quiet transformation of hearts. There's a story about how, years after the war, one of the children he rescued tracked him down to thank him. She told him she'd always wondered if he remembered her. He smiled and said, "I remember every child." Maybe he didn't remember every face in detail, but in spirit, he did. Each name on that list was personal to him. He wasn't saving anonymous lives. He was saving children with favorite songs, little fears, dreams of growing up. Even now, decades later, his lessons feel painfully relevant. We live in a world where refugees still cross borders, where families are still separated by war, where bureaucracies still hesitate while lives hang in the balance. Winton's story isn't just history. It's a mirror held up to the present, asking, what would you do? Would you make that list? Would you help? Would you care enough to act even when no one's watching? Those are uncomfortable questions, but they're the right ones. When people ask how a single person can change the world, I think of Nicholas Winton sitting at his desk, cigarette in hand, surrounded by paperwork, knowing he couldn't save everyone, but determined to save someone. That's the truth of it. The world doesn't need perfect heroes. It needs people who do what they can, where they are, with what they have. Years after his story became famous, he was asked whether he believed humanity had learned anything from the war. He sighed and said, "Not enough." But then he smiled and added, "There's always hope, and maybe that's the heart of it. Hope not as a word, but as a habit." something you practice every day by refusing to give in to apathy. His legacy isn't confined to museums or history books. It lives in classrooms, in refugee shelters, in people who see injustice and decide to do something. There's a scholarship in his name that supports young humanitarians. A tree planted in Israel that grows beside the names of the righteous among the nations. And a statue on the platform in Prague where trains once departed into the unknown. But his truest monument isn't made of bronze. It's the generations of lives that exist because he chose to care. I sometimes imagine that if you could gather all of Winton's children, their children, and their children's children in one place, the crowd would fill a stadium. Thousands of lives intertwined by a single act of decency. You could look at that crowd and see the entire argument for why doing good matters. Even when the odds are against you, he used to say that kindness is contagious. That once someone sees you doing something good, it gives them permission to do the same. And he was right. After his story aired in the late 80s, donations to refugee organizations surged. People wrote to charities asking how they could help modern-day children in need. His example sparked a movement. Quiet, steady, unstoppable. That's what makes Nicholas Winton so different from the larger-than-life heroes of history. His greatness came from ordinariness, from the belief that the smallest actions, done sincerely, can outweigh mountains of despair. He didn't fight with weapons or speeches. He fought with paperwork, persuasion, and persistence. He fought with kindness. When the world talks about the Second World War, it often focuses on the horror, the battles, the bombings, the concentration camps. But stories like Winton's remind us that even in the darkest chapters, there were lights, not bright enough to erase the darkness, but bright enough to guide others through it. That's all any of us can really hope to be. So if you've stayed with this story till now, take a moment right now to subscribe if you haven't yet, leave a like, and share this video with someone who believes humanity still has good in it. Because stories like this aren't meant to be hidden in history books. They're meant to be passed on, told again and again, until they become part of who we are. And as we close, think of that image, Nicholas Winton standing on the platform, coat collar turned up against the cold, watching a train full of children pull away into safety. He doesn't wave dramatically. He doesn't call out. He just stands there, quietly, making sure the last door is shut. Then he turns and walks back into the city, ready to organize the next one. That's courage. That's legacy. Not noise, not glory. Just the quiet certainty that doing the right thing, even when no one notices, changes everything.